Now we're very honored and thrilled to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Melissa Anderson. Let me go ahead and give you a brief bio. Melissa is a Gallaudet-trained psychologist and clinical researcher who strives to provide access in behavioral health in the deaf community. Melissa is a co-chair of Stakeholder Engagement Program in the UMass School, Implementation of Science, Practices, and Research Center. She is also the director of DeafYES, Deaf Empowerment and Recovery. Her career within the deaf community has only been successful because of her engagement and actions of her work. Her clinical team serves as a research study and are co-led by deaf professionals and laypersons, ensuring that that work is very relevant and accessible. In addition to community co-leadership model, Melissa and her team continue to infuse the voices of deaf community members in their work via ongoing qualitative interviews, focus groups, and community forums. Please welcome Dr. Melissa Anderson. Now I gotta look for her screen so that I can pin her. So just a minute with me, if you can bear with me. There's Melissa. Okay, perfect. Now I see you. Let me make sure I can pin the interpreters really quick. And we're going to go ahead and take this opportunity to switch interpreters.
Okay, let me adjust this from myself. Okay, the floor is yours. We are ready to go.
Just checking before I go, can everyone see me in front of my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you so much, Trish, for the lovely introduction. And it's funny that you talk about the planning journey of the past couple of years. I remember the beginning of April last year thinking, oh, I'm not going to cancel my flight yet. We'll wait it out. This might pass in a couple of weeks. And here we are a year later, still figuring out how to live in pandemic times. So really amazing job to the planning committee for making this happen despite pretty intense challenges. So today I am honored to be here with all of you talking about the field of deaf mental health care. And I'm going to be highlighting some of the achievements of the past 10 years, really exciting initiatives that have been happening, and also making some suggestions about where I think the field is going and should go in the future. So before I jump in, you might be wondering, like, who is this lady and why is she here? So I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. I'm hearing, as you might have guessed already, but I was fortunate to do my graduate training at Gallaudet University, which many of you probably know, is a university for deaf and hard of hearing students, and then also some other hearing students who are fluent in American Sign Language. So I was very fortunate to learn how to practice psychology through Gallaudet and the community there. For the past 10 years, I have been at UMass in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I've been able to provide therapy to a variety of deaf clients, working on trauma, addiction, depression, and other concerns. And so a lot of my work has been informed by the expertise and experiences of my clients. And then the past 7 years, I've also been doing research on how to adapt evidence-based therapies to be more deaf-friendly. Or in other words, really investigating like what are the best practices to make therapy more accessible to deaf people who use sign language. So that is who I am and why I'm here, but you can always feel free to reach out and ask me more. So for our agenda today, as I mentioned before, we're going to be talking about some important achievements or gains that have happened in the past 10 years. Really 3 major ones. So documentation of health and mental health disparities, targeting the causes of these disparities, and then developing treatments to hopefully help those disparities go away over time. Then we're going to talk about some next steps. And then my goal is to leave at least 15 minutes at the end for some question, answer, discussion, that type of thing. So before I jump into the agenda, first I'm going to take a sip of my water here. And then I want to make sure that we are on the same page about what I mean when I say the word deaf. So today when I'm referring to deaf people, the deaf community, what I mean to refer to is about 500,000 or more people in the US who have significant hearing loss and communicate primarily through American Sign Language. This community group, often the individuals in this community are deaf from birth or within the first few years after birth. That's not always the case, but often people who identify themselves as culturally deaf are deaf from an early age. And I'm really emphasizing the community of deaf people who identify as culturally deaf versus the medical definition of deafness or hearing loss. And what I mean by that is that these individuals may not identify as being part of a disability group. Rather, they are more focused on what they do have. So they have art and literature, history, culture, language, shared experience, versus focusing on what they don't have, which is, the loss of hearing or limited hearing. And so when I talk today about the deaf community, that's really what I mean. Okay. So we're going to start by talking about health disparities related to the mental health field. So within the past 10 years, a number of researchers, both in the US and internationally, have started to provide some strong documentation that deaf people and deaf adults and deaf children are more likely to experience mental health concerns than the general population, or hearing adults and hearing children. And so, for example, some research has found that deaf people are twice as likely to report mood or anxiety disorders. So, for example, depression, generalized anxiety, panic, those sorts of disorders. Deaf people are 3 times as likely to be problem drinkers than individuals with no hearing loss, and twice as likely to experience trauma exposure compared to the general population. And I recognize that, you know, this might not seem like an exciting development in the field of deaf mental health, you know, not something to call a gain. But I want to emphasize how important it is that we finally have these numbers and these statistics documented and published, because so often resources, funds, services are directed to the groups that can prove that there's a problem. And so what has been really important in the past 10, 20 years about documenting this problem is that now we finally have the proof to, you know, submit grant proposals, submit proposals for resources to our states, to the federal government, to say, we have a problem. Look at these numbers. We have a problem and we need your funds, your money to really help this go away over time. So I recognize that the numbers are a little disheartening, but the fact that they're finally documented means that we can do something about it. Okay. So now moving on to targeting causes of these mental health disparities or inequities. And I apologize if you can hear my neighbor's dog howling, but there's nothing I can do about it. So hopefully she'll stop. This is the beauty of working from home. So in the past 10 years, there's been a really monumental study published, and a lot has come out of this. You may have heard about this before, but just in case you haven't, I want to give you some background. So it's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or a lot of people call it the ACEs study. And this was a really large study conducted in Southern California by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. And they surveyed 17,000 people, which is a really huge number of people to have in a research study. They surveyed them about their childhood experiences, and then they gave them health checkups and followed their health records over time. And so they really wanted to know, what is the relationship between our childhood experiences and our later health and well-being as adults. And so what they found is that adverse childhood experiences, so potentially traumatic events that can occur between 0 and 17. Some examples would be abuse, neglect. It could also be poverty, parental divorce, just any event that can happen in childhood that might cause the child a lot of stress. So these are common. You know, that's probably not a shock to anyone here, but they found that 61% of people reported that they had at least one potentially traumatic, stressful event that happened to them as a child. 20% of people, so 1 out of 5 people, reported that they had experienced 3 or more of these stressful events during their childhood. And what these researchers were able to identify is that having these stressful experiences in childhood was directly related to adulthood chronic health problems, so like heart health, obesity, mental health problems in adulthood, and increased substance use. And the people who had 4, 5, 6, 7 adverse childhood experiences were much more likely to experience these kinds of problems than people with 1 stressful experience. So they basically found that it was, we call it dose dependent. So the more stressful experiences someone had in their childhood, the more likely they were to have health problems, mental health problems, and addiction problems in adulthood. And this was a really important study because it finally showed that obviously mental health and physical health are related, and whatever we can do to really nurture the development of our children will help promote the overall health of our nation over time. And I just wanted to show this one image that the ACEs study published. And they basically say that, you know, we have this foundation of historical trauma in society, which I think is pretty apparent right now with everything that's going on with the George Floyd trial. This trauma sets up different social conditions like poverty, access to education. These social conditions can make some people more likely to experience adverse childhood experiences. Once people experience those stressors or traumas, their neurodevelopment or their brain development might be impacted, which then might impact their social, emotional, and cognitive development. They might be, because of that, more likely to engage in different health risk behaviors, you know, drinking, smoking, risky behavior causes disease. And what they're finding is the people who report more adverse childhood experiences actually, on average, die earlier than people with no or fewer adverse childhood experiences. And so this was a huge finding because it really emphasizes that we need to be doing a much better job of, as a society, of how we nurture and raise our children. So in no way is this meant to be parent shaming. This is really talking about how our country is set up to raise children to be healthy and well. So that giant 17,000 person study was done with the general population, not with deaf people specifically in mind. And to date, no one has published a study doing ACEs work within the deaf community. But there are some things that we do know about attachment and other early experiences in the deaf community that I wanted to share with you that I think are relevant. So the first, caregiver attachment. So some research has been done to show that regardless of what communication mode parents of deaf children choose to use with their deaf child, the most important factor in the health of their attachment or their relationship is how well the parents supported their child's emotional needs. Other important factors in healthy attachment are parental stress. So parents who are more stressed have a harder time relating to their children in healthy ways. So we need to be thinking about interventions to help parents with their stress levels. So caregiver attachment is an important thing to think about when we think about the early life experiences of deaf children. Also important to think about communication access in home, school, and medical settings. And again, this is not a commentary or criticism on whatever communication modes you choose to use with your child, but the key is that there is access. So does the child feel a sense of belonging with their family, with their school setting? Do they feel like they can be a participant in conversations, or do they feel isolated and left out? And that's really the core of it. And what we hear, at least what I hear from some of my clients who grew up in families where communication was not great, is this concept called the dinner table syndrome, where the deaf person sits at the table with hearing family members and everyone's just talking around them, and they unfortunately don't know what's going on and feel quite left out. So it's really about inclusion and access more than any particular communication choice. We also know that some deaf people report punishment or bullying related to communication. So I would like to think and hope that this is more a thing of the past than current, but there were many schools that used to punish deaf children physically. If they used sign language, they would be wrapped with a ruler or some other physical punishment. And there are stories that children tell of their peers, both deaf and hearing, bullying them for their speech skills or their sign skills. They're not hearing enough, but they're also not deaf enough. And so that's definitely a theme when we think about these adverse childhood experiences. A fourth topic that I want to hit on, and I'm going to spend some more time here, is language deprivation. And this may or may not be a term that you're familiar with, so I'll take some time to explain. So if you didn't know already, it's estimated that 90 to 95% of deaf children are born into hearing families. If we think about a hearing baby who's born to a hearing person. So for example, I have a 5-month-old. So let's use my 5-month-old as an example. He's hearing, I'm hearing. So he was born 5 months ago. And from the moment he was born, he heard me talking to him. He heard me talking to my husband. He heard my husband talking. It's just natural exposure to language that he can access. And so even though he's only 5 months old, he's obviously not talking yet. I don't know that he can understand us, but he's exposed to all this language in his environment totally naturally. We don't have to think about it. It just happens. For deaf children born into hearing families, it's not that natural. So more thought, attention, and choice needs to be put into how the deaf child can access language. For some families, that might mean the parents choose to learn sign language. For other families, if the child benefits from a hearing aid or some sort of other device. Maybe it means spoken English or some other choice. It's all about whether that exposure is fully accessible to the child. So it's not an easy thing to do. And I don't think parents always receive all the information that they need to make these choices. So because of that, many deaf kids born into hearing families might not get full access to language until school age or even later. And when we think about, my baby who's getting this full exposure to language all the time, compared to someone who might not get full language exposure till 5 years old, that has some impacts. It can delay language development, it can delay thinking skills, social skills, and the child's ability to regulate or manage their emotions. And so on the next slide, I actually have a video, but I believe someone from the team here was going to play it for me. So I hope that person is here. Okay, great. So someone's going to play it for me. Just let me know if I need to do anything like stop share or anything like that. Okay, so let me just get back to where I was. And I saw in the chat box that folks were concerned about the sound. So actually there's no information that happens in the sound. There's just background music. The whole thing is presented visually. And if you didn't get a chance to watch it because you were trying to figure out the sound, I will absolutely, I'm writing a note to myself to put the video link in the chat box so you can watch it again later, because I do think it's an important video. It basically shows the trajectory of someone who has access from language to language from birth compared to someone who doesn't, and how that can impact their ability to communicate, think, develop healthy emotions, etc. So I'll absolutely share that video link in the chat box once I'm done blabbering. Okay. So luckily, now that I've just highlighted all of the problems and the causes of these problems, luckily in the past 10 years, people have also been working to address these issues, to solve the cause of these inequities in mental health. And I'm going to review some of those efforts now so that you have a sense of what resources might become available quite soon. So just like a little language check so that we're on the same page. So there's this phrase that people throw around, evidence-based practices or evidence-based therapies. And this, just in case you haven't come across this before, you did and you weren't sure what it meant, this means that it's a therapy or other intervention that has gone through a formal research process through clinical trials and found to lead to a positive outcome in a population. So this would be the same for a therapy or a new medication, or I'll use a recent example, a vaccine. So in the recent development of the COVID-19 vaccines, there were research studies done where human participants were randomly assigned to either receive the vaccination or receive like a fake vaccination, we call it placebo. And then after that happened, they compared the rates of COVID illness in both groups. And thankfully, what they found is that in the group of people who were randomly assigned to get the new vaccine, the rates of COVID illness were much lower than in the group who got the fake or the placebo vaccine. And so we use the same process when we're talking about therapy and counseling and how to research new therapies and prove that they work. So I don't know if you've come across this alphabet soup, but there are therapies that have been proven to work, like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, motivational interviewing, and so on and so on. There's a lot of these ABCs around. But my question, and you can just throw your answer quickly in the chat box. What do you think? How many evidence-based therapies have been developed for and evaluated through clinical trials with deaf people? None. Let's see. Probably none. 0. Haha, none. You guys are too good. So you're correct. There are currently no officially evidence-based therapies for deaf people. There are some in the works that are going through the beginning stages of clinical trials, but this field is relatively young. people have only been doing research on this topic, on how to develop these therapies in the deaf community for like the past 10, 20 years. And unfortunately, research takes a really long time. But I'm going to tell you about some of these opportunities. And actually, I'm going to just jump ahead a couple slides to make sure I have time for the important stuff. So one recent effort that I want to highlight is around what's called parent-child interaction therapy. And this therapy was actually developed in the 1970s for hearing children between the ages of 2 and 7. And it was developed to help families who had children with disruptive behavior or emotional problems. And over the past, the past 50 years, there have been multiple clinical trials of this type of therapy. And they found proof that it helps improve parent-child relationships and how much children cooperate or listen to their parents. So it really reduces negative child behavior and parents being harsh disciplinarians. And it creates, they call it an upward spiral of parents being more consistent and validating and approving and more positive child responses. And what's promising is that PCIT, parent-child interaction therapy, has already been adapted for a lot of different populations who are not the general hearing population. So what's really exciting is that in 2014, Gallaudet University established the PCIT clinic within the Department of Psychology. It's run by Dr. Lori Day, Loriday. And they provide PCIT to families in the Washington, D.C. area, any family that has a deaf family member. And they followed a cultural adaptation process to make sure that the treatment is visually accessible, accessible in terms of language, and culturally consistent with deaf cultural values. And what's especially exciting is that they've already had the chance to do a pilot research study where they looked at 20 different families. And after they provided this therapy, they saw that parents' skills in how to interact with their deaf children improved significantly. The intensity of the child's behavior problem reduced, and the children by the end of the therapy were much more cooperative and compliant with their parents than they had been at the beginning. So really exciting initial results. It's not yet, a full clinical trial like the vaccine trials I was talking about, but it's on its way to getting there soon. What's also great is that they're looking at the data that they collected, and they're finding that not only does PCIT improve child's behavior and the parent's skills, but they're also finding that it's really positive for the child's language development. So the hope here is that the more that this PCIT work develops and hopefully becomes accessible across the country, we're really addressing those adverse childhood experiences that we talked about before, so that we're stopping mental health concerns before they even start. Okay, so I'm also just going to quickly touch on some work that's being done to develop therapies for deaf adults who have developed mental health problems. I'm just going to go through them quickly because I do feel like the audience here is more focused on youth and family interventions, but it's worth a mention that really in the US, the pioneering work on adapting therapies to be more deaf friendly happened around the treatment called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. And that work was done at the Deaf Wellness Center in Rochester, where they made filmed teaching stories with deaf actors to help teach different concepts from that therapy. Some other work was done by Neil Glickman, also in Massachusetts, and his partners at Partners, P-A-H. Yeah. So they are in Pennsylvania, and they work together on adapting cognitive behavioral therapy for deaf clients. And the culmination of their work was a manual to really teach staff and clinicians how to better work with deaf people. Seeking safety and signs of safety is actually my work, my research. So a little pat on the back to myself here, which feels a little awkward. But seeking safety is a treatment for trauma and addiction. And so my team has worked to make a deaf-friendly adaptation toolkit. So different videos, visual handouts to make that more accessible to deaf people. And we are testing it in a small clinical trial right now. So if we get positive results, it could be one of the first evidence-based therapies for deaf people. And then there have been a number of international efforts around adapting therapies. So in Australia, there are groups looking at DBT, but also constructionist therapy. In Spain, they're trying to adapt something called solution-focused therapy. And there are other efforts going on in Iran and the Netherlands. And even though these are just initial steps in the research process, they are very important first steps because they are the foundation for everything that is to come. And so I do predict that in the next 10 years, we will see multiple evidence-based therapies become available for deaf people with mental health conditions. Okay, so a few minutes on next steps. So like I said, we need to get it together and conduct more clinical trials so that we can prove that these approaches that we're adapting to help deaf people are safe and that they actually work. Once we have these evidence-based tools, it's really important that we make them openly accessible to the public. So this is not a business model. This is not a money maker. We need to make sure that these tools become available to anyone who needs them free of charge. And we also need to make sure that once we have these evidence-based tools that we're taking the time and energy to train clinicians how to use them well. I apologize, I have some green screen issues going on. My cat is trying to eat it, so hopefully it will not topple over on me. But really now that the pandemic has happened and really the mental health field in general has finally embraced telehealth, we need to take advantage of that and be training deaf accessible clinicians nationwide in how to use these tools. We need to be training them via Zoom, and we need to be supporting them to provide telehealth to our clients who might not be able to make it in person. To do this, I feel like it's going to be really important to have strong collaborations with nationwide practices. So one example that I'll throw out there is called National Deaf Therapy. And so that's a telehealth practice for deaf clients that has therapists in many states. So I foresee some of the future of this work happening through collaborations with that group and with other similar groups where we're training their therapists in these evidence-based practices. And I think not that it's too late to capture people once they're already therapists, but we can also capture people early in their training. So partnering with Gallaudet University or other universities and training their students in these important approaches before they graduate. The other problem is that we just don't have enough people doing research. We don't have enough people to do the work. It seems that there's actually funding available to do this research, but we just don't have the people to do it. And so we need to invest in our researcher pipeline. So partnering with Gallaudet and other universities with deaf programs to recruit people into the therapy research field. Once we've recruited them, then we need to do things like invest in their training, in postdoctoral fellowships or other opportunities where they receive good mentorship in how to become a researcher. And then if they are able to become faculty, mentoring those individuals too, so that they're retained in the field. That's the biggest problem. We don't have the research workforce to be doing this work. And so we need to really be investing in the future of the field. So with that, oh, good, I did well on time. So I want to leave time for questions and answers. There's my little question guy. But I actually will stop sharing so I can just be done with the PowerPoint. Oh, sorry, I screwed it all up for Trish. I think Trish is just gonna pin me again.
Just a moment, and we will switch interpreters. One moment.
Okay, perfect. So we do have one question. Let me try to get that up here. A question was from asking about the PCIT, if those studies were done with any Spanish-speaking families. Any of those studies done with any Spanish-speaking families?
That is a really good question. And I actually don't know the answer, but I will look in the chat box. Let's see, for who wrote it. And I'll actually respond to you with the contact information for—
It was Angela Sanchez.
Okay. So Angela, I'm going to respond to you.
Okay. The next question, can you tell us more about how you were sharing your webcam directly on the PowerPoint? Okay. All right, new technology thing here. Okay. One of our tech people actually can add that information in there for you. Can you repeat what the acronym PCIT stands for, please?
Absolutely. So PCIT stands for Parent-Child Interaction Therapy. So it's all about coaching the parent and the child to better communicate, better how the parent can better validate or reinforce the child's positive behaviors instead of using harsh discipline.
Okay, next question. What efforts are being made to have therapists who are fluent in sign language approved through Medicaid? We are finding that there's a big issue in finding therapists, and they find it, but we can't use them because of Medicaid. That is a big problem.
So here in Massachusetts, we are pretty fortunate that we have an ombudsman program, and they will, so it's a deaf ombudsman program, and they actually help sign fluent therapists become approved by or paneled on different insurance companies, including Medicaid and other public insurance options. So the fact that these therapists use sign language actually really helps them get on the insurance panels. And it sounds like in Texas, there isn't a similar mechanism.
No, right. Yeah, that is a problem here in Texas. So that's one of the issues. Next question. Does National Deaf Therapy serve children as well? I actually can answer that one. So we actually recently started a connection with them. Now, it's not very young children as of yet, but high school age. There are some for middle school, and depending upon their needs and who they're able to mesh well with a therapist. As far as a therapist having some experience with children, then yes, that's possible. We are still in the works and the process of trying to get more therapists for children. So we're still somewhat limited there, but it is coming. Okay, let me see. Next question. In addition to Angela Sanchez's question, this was from Ashley Woods asking, does the study include multilingual families? And that was her question in addition to the Spanish speaking question.
So I will also respond to you with direct contact information for Dr. Lori Day, so that it's her work, so she's the expert and can answer that. I know not all of the families exclusively used American Sign Language. So there may have been a mix of some spoken language and American Sign Language, but she can really provide you the information. And actually also there was a paper published about her studies. So I'll include a link to that publication.
Okay, great. Next question. Are there any studies that you can share specifics of mental health or therapy with deaf adolescents that do have language deprivation?
It's a really good question. I don't think there have been intervention studies published on working with children, adolescents, or even adults with language deprivation. I would say in the past 5 years is when I started seeing more professional publications just about what is language deprivation. But I haven't seen it get to the stage of talking about therapy interventions with that group yet.
Okay. Next question. Does National Deaf Therapists contract with school districts in providing therapy to students? Good question. You'll need to reach out to them and ask them directly. At this time, I don't believe so, but they do contract with EAP and HR school districts. But for children directly, I don't know as of yet. But that is a good question. Next question. A comment saying, Dr. Hill Clemens' work suggests language deprivation and mental health needs of deaf individuals. Yes, but as far as studies in relation to that, so I've seen that book. It's a very, very good book with that. Why is there so little studies and just general basic needs that are provided for the deaf community? That's the very last question.
Sorry, took a big breath there. So first, getting research funding is not the easiest thing I've ever done. So just an example, I mentioned that right now I'm doing a small, they call it a pilot clinical trial. It's not the real deal yet. It's the small one before the real deal. I submitted the grant 4 times. It took 3 years to get the funding to do the study. So the funding does exist, but it's not necessarily easy to get. And so I think we need to be training people and mentoring them to be able to do it and to be able to do it and not give up. Because I see a lot of people who are passionate about doing this work, who really care about the issues, and who become very discouraged or burnt out because it is challenging. It is challenging. And I'll say that in the past presidential administration, things got a little scary when it seemed like funding to the National Institutes of Health might get cut, because that's where our research money comes from. So it did get scary for a bit about, like, will we be able to even continue this work? So I think the more we can invest in growing the researchers, the more we will see. But it's not the easiest job I've ever had, but I do love it. So if we can get more passionate people and support them to stick with it, I think we can really do a lot of good.
And there's one question that says, National Deaf Therapy, I like the idea, but how does that work with state licenses? So good question. They do have different therapists from a variety of states with different licensures, and they are contracted with National Deaf Therapy. Is that correct? Yeah. So that's, from my understanding, is how they're able to connect and work with the different states. So there's more exposure, more access to people virtually.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we are knowing. Go ahead, Nad.
And also they have a number of therapists who are licensed in a couple states. So this is often this happens a lot in, like, New England, where we get someone who's licensed in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island, because they're all really small and close together. But I think they have a good number of therapists who hold active licenses in 2 or 3 states. And so they're able to provide more access that way as well.
Let's see. Okay. Next question. How do you suggest that we support and advocate for more research? Are there specific contacts that we need to make?
So this is a really good question, one that's not been posed to me before. But every 5 years, NIH, so the National Institutes of Health, all the different institutes that make up NIH, every 5 years, they come up with a new strategic plan for the following 5 years. And in that strategic plan, they set their priorities for what they want to fund. And so their funding decisions, their decisions on what projects to fund, are usually aligned with that strategic plan. Before the strategic plans are written, they hold an online open call for information or requests. And so what I would say is that if you're passionate about this area and want to advocate and lobby for more funding for deaf mental health, I would get on the listserv for the institute called NIMH. So it's the National Institute on Mental Health. And so you'd want to be looking for, they want information for their strategic plan, and then just like throw it in there so that they can't ignore it. You know, that could be something that Trish or other folks could send out to everyone and say, get on this. The other institute where we've received funding is it's NIDCD, the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders. It's not the best name, but they have funded some of our research about how to train healthcare providers, how to better interact with deaf people. So I would target those two institutes and look for when it's coming up to their time to renew their strategic plan, and send that around and get everyone to harass them so that they can't ignore it. And if it ends up in the strategic plan, it's much more likely that anyone doing this work will have it funded. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Good strategy. One last question. Do you know of any studies that are specifically for those who are deafblind?
I don't, and I'm sad to say that I don't. And I think especially during the pandemic, and thinking how we had to take our clinical trial that was totally in person and make it a Zoom clinical trial, the barriers for deafblind participants joining our trial have only increased. So I think, you know, if I could go back and redo my slides, I think one of the future areas for the next 10 years needs to be focused on how to provide access to deaf-blind mental health consumers.
Okay. It's now 2:15. If there are no other questions that I don't see any more. I just want to thank you so much for being here. I'm happy you were here to give this presentation to us, and I really greatly appreciate you being here for us. So thank you very much. And I hope you're able to stay with us for the rest of the afternoon just to see how the symposium is going.
Thank you so much.
Sure.